Thank you so much, Jason, again for this opportunity, and thank you everyone for taking time out of your busy days. As I was talking to Jason earlier, each week feels like a lifetime right now, not just in the world of admissions, but certainly in the US of A. And I know it's quite stressful, so things can feel kind of out of step. I always joke that there's this cognitive dissonance around talking about a very niche topic like testing, when clearly there are far more important things that are higher up on the totem pole. A little bit about me, if you're new to Compass or to My Little Dog and Pony show that I'll be sharing, of course, the stage with Eric. I've been within this world for the better part of 13 years. It was the first gig that I got out of undergraduate. I was a UC Santa Cruz banana slug and worked as a tutor, a consultant on the topic of testing, similar to Eric's role as a director, shepherding families through the testing side of admissions. And now I have the immense pleasure of speaking to audiences like you across the country, both independent counselors, school counselors, and predominantly audiences of families engaging in this process. And Eric and I are always doing this balancing act and trying to determine for families what the correct posture they should take toward these exams. And the elephant in the room is, at least for the class of 2021, but I would not be surprised if this continues well into the future, definitely for class of 2022. We'll talk more about colleges and their various decisions, but 97% of colleges right now across the country are test optional. And there's a great big question mark as to whether or not these exams have the same level of relevance and whether or not some students can graciously just bow out and ignore testing entirely. And I think there is a middle ground, as we'll talk about, that the rule of thumb these days, I would argue, is that we want to keep the spaces of possibility open with regard to colleges and still plan to take these exams. But one of the silver linings of the pandemic, if there can be any, is the right sizing effect that it has had on the importance of admission testing. So students are certainly now more empowered and get to determine whether or not test scores enhance their portfolio, or if they are better suited to not include that piece of information and when to make those distinctions. Okay. Eric, before I move forward with the slide deck, is there anything that you want to say before we get started?
No, that's the big issue on the table. And my perspective to this will be more, I'm kind of in the trenches talking to families every day, many in Chicago, but in Pennsylvania too, Ohio, Texas, all over. So I'll try to thread through, yes, our time-honored advice, much of which, spoiler alert, actually still kind of applies despite the tumultuous changes in the testing landscape. But I'll try to just thread through some of the anecdotes and what I'm hearing from parents as well. I'll be curious if it matches up with what you're hearing and in your interactions with parents and students as we're kind of, navigating this as well with, the main concerns parents are coming at us with their students, particularly the class of 2022. And I'll save my spiel intro for when I take over a little bit, Matt. I'll turn it back to you.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, Eric. As we said earlier, this is going to be recorded. I saw Jason hit that little button, so that's definitely happening. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So if you could hold your questions and or pop them in the chat box, we'll then review them at the end. And Jason or Eric, if there's something super pressing that comes in when I'm speaking, and then Eric vice versa via the chat, we can unmute ourselves, pose the question if we feel like it's going to align with what we're talking about rather than going on a tangent. All right. Okay, so here we go, folks. Generally, this is the agenda today, and I was laughing about how much the January presentation that we gave in 2020 was just so different and less pertinent to what we're talking about now. We were making a big stink about ACT mostly, and their SuperScore reports and the coming surge of digital testing, computer-based testing at schools. And that just does not matter anymore. So we're not even going to touch on that unless it comes up in the Q&A, but you can imagine that both for College Board and ACT, their timelines for that type of rollout of a program are delayed, although there are some rumblings about ACT having a fail-safe at-home online digital ACT perhaps later this spring, although there are lots of questions about equity and access, the incredibly high cost of doing this type of exam. That's a topic for later. Generally, we're talking about the relevance of tests in the age of COVID, the current state of the test optional landscape, which I liken to a Baskin Robbins of 31 flavors, and it's very difficult to divine the path forward for some of your families. And then Eric will be speaking on some of the more time-honored Compass guidance. So to test or not to test, making the decision SAT or ACT, building a preparation timeline this year, in particular, class of 2022, given the dearth of available testing opportunities, although ideally there will be more if the pandemic wanes. And if there's time, how test prep actually works. So again, some of this may be review for you. If you've seen a similar testing presentation by Compass, we'll try and move at a clipped pace and focus on some of the more newsy information that you're curious about. Of course, colleges across the country have embraced students with a great wave of empathy. I have some highfalutin names here with Cornell, Case Western, and Yale, all saying, families, we recognize where you're coming from. You will not be penalized in the application review process because of things like remote learning, the changing of transcripts in some cases from letter grades to pass-fail, the suspension of co and extracurricular activities, and of course, what affects our narrow field of view at Compass, limited testing opportunities. And it's likely, this was of course directed at the class of 2021, but it still holds true for the class of 2022. And I think we'll see more colleges later this winter making statements, especially if test optional policies are re-upped. Generally, the argument for why test scores are used is articulated here in this lovely graphic. So when we look at the distribution of GPAs amongst students in 1997 applying to four-year colleges, B averages are most common. And then 20 years later, A's eclipse B's, making a 4.0 the most common GPA across the country. And I include GPA here because year over year in the admissions report done by NACAC, they often cite cumulative GPA as the most predictive factor of academic performance in college. Of course, it is susceptible to other external factors like grade inflation. And colleges have long utilized these tests, often likening them to a common yardstick to make meaningful comparisons amongst applicants. And with the admissions game that we have today, where schools are receiving tens of thousands of applications, I think UCLA broke the new record this year with over 140,000 applications. There's this desire to have a decoding mechanism for the transcript. And it's because of the consistency of these exams that they are so highly valued. So again, this is review. You've probably seen this graphic a million times, but this is the distribution of ACT scores for the class of 2017. It's mostly stayed stable in the years prior to the class of 2017 and even up to now. And I could also transpose the SAT distribution out of 1,600 points. It would look shockingly similar, all right? So most students perform at the center, and this is because the test items themselves are calibrated by the psychometricians, the people that make these exams, to pull the same proportion, ideally, of correct and incorrect answers for students, right? So exams that are engineered to reproduce these outcomes will often say at Compass, one, not every student is meant to get a perfect score, and simultaneously, endless effort does not yield endless reward on these exams. So when we talk about score improvement, although there might be broad proclamations by folks in our industry, we'll often say that relative gains hinge on relative standing, where you are with an initial PSAT result, a practice SAT or ACT. That will help you determine what is my soft ceiling of potential, my plateau, and then when does it make sense for us to gracefully step away from the table. because a reasonable amount of effort is going to yield the bulk of improvement on these assessments. If you want to get a better understanding of what a good score is on these exams, fortunately, we still have the annual data that's reported by colleges, although it's likely that with COVID and the increase of test optional policies, I'd argue that the mid 50th percentile ranges are likely to rise at many schools. And it's because you have mostly those students who are self-selecting, who are saying, our scores look marketable, look good, and the bad apples are refusing to send in their scores. So averages rise, right? But based on the data that we have right now, and you can look at Compass's website, our guide to college admission testing that you may be familiar with, we track about 416 colleges across the country. And normally we'll say if your score falls somewhere within the middle of these last two columns here, based on the school to which you're applying, you can softly check off the testing requirement. Of course, it certainly gives you some brownie points if you're at the top of that range or even above it. But I like to also make fun of what I call the purple unicorn schools like Yale, where outstanding scores fail to stand out, right? You look at their mid 50th percentile ranges, we're already getting close to like the 99th percentile on average. So instead, I like to think of a good score as a means to an end, something that does its job, and it's one that blends in with these institutional averages. Which is then a good segue into this conversation of test optional, which I'm sure many of you are most interested in hearing about. Again, test optional, when I describe it to families, and I've stolen this from both Eric and one of our other co-directors, Dulcie, in our New York office. Test optional means that your application is complete with or without the inclusion of a test score. Okay, and just brass tacks, as simple as it can be. I think that there have been two extreme reactions to the ubiquity of test optional policies. On one end, there are some students who think, well, it's basically going to be easier to get into so many colleges, especially for highly selectives. Why not just throw my hat in the ring and my odds are going to increase when I apply to Harvard or the University of Pennsylvania or a top liberal arts college. Okay. Conversely, there are some students that say this makes tests even more important than before, and I absolutely must just like blow the top off of my SAT or ACT to even be considered for admission at a top school, because my chances are that much slimmer with an applicant pool filled with students not submitting test scores and those that just have really great ones. So, of course, there's probably a happy medium between these two, which I hope to address. Fortunately, there's this really great blog post that my colleague and one of the founders at Compass, Bruce Reed, had written called "Colleges Are Now Test Optional. Is It That Simple?" The lead is buried in that title. Of course, it is not that simple. And I'll try and summarize this with Eric as best I can within the time that we have. But definitely go onto our website and check out this blog post. To show how sweeping things have changed since 2019 until now, when we tracked our list of colleges, the vast majority were requiring the tests. About a third were test optional, and what is now likely a vestigial policy that no longer exists. Actually, the term I think has been co-opted and means something completely different. There were a handful of institutions that were test flexible, like NYU. This was when NYU and I believe Middlebury for a while would allow students to turn in an SAT or an ACT to satisfy the admissions testing requirement, or a few subject tests, AP exams, the IB diploma, all of that would satisfy the testing requirement. Here is where we are now, all right? So the vast majority of colleges are exercising some permutation of test optional, with the firm majority on the one-year trial side of things, and then those engaged in a multi-year trial. I would argue that those doing a one-year trial are probably hedging in favor of having these tests submitted from students. Basically, understanding their utility year over year, but not wanting to penalize applicants who simply did not have the opportunity to test. They want to keep their applicant pools competitive, the gears of the admissions process turning, and not turn away any really great candidates, right? They're, I think, signaling not a radical departure from testing. In fact, they're more likely, I think, to relinquish a test optional policy for the class of 2022. Although it's looking, as the pandemic continues to surge, that we'll see more and more colleges adopting policy. I believe that, was it Baylor, Eric, that already announced that it was going forward with test optional for another year?
They're going for another 2 years, Baylor, so up through class of 2023. And then this isn't officially released yet, but Northeastern also will be going test optional for another year, just for the class of 2022.
Fabulous. And I think Cornell is planning to make an announcement sometime in February. So as more and more colleges step up to the plate, I think just like last year, when there were some firm stances amongst colleges, there will be a cascading effect and more folks will declare the continuation of their policies. The multi-year group, I think, is super duper cool because they want to have the data to back the test optional policy. So they're looking at the performance of both submitters and non-submitters of test scores once they are matriculating. And that could then provide evidence for continuing the policy or getting rid of it, okay? And then obviously the minorities in this pool are the sad Sally folks that still required the SAT or ACT and saw some pretty severe punishments for doing so. The University of Florida system, I know, because of state mandates around test scores, the Department of Education there, as a result of them just holding on to it, they saw a steep decline in applicants. And then a smaller group that is also getting a lot of attention, and for good reason, those that were formerly known as test blind. The term that's in vogue now is test free, that will not even allow students the opportunity to submit an SAT or ACT result. They're basically thrown into the dumpster like hot garbage. And the rationale for going test free is usually couched in terms of diversity and equity, understanding that certain groups of students have been disenfranchised or underperform on these exams relative to academic performance in college, students of color, female identified test takers, others who have found that the test scores are just not interesting as a facet of the admissions puzzle. Like I believe Caltech and Reed have both come forward and said, the majority of our applicants have immaculate transcripts and test scores. What we really care most about are the qualitative, the more humanistic elements of the application that will really make them stand out and contribute to our freshman class. So at a rigorous STEM program like Caltech, it might be not necessarily a test score that helps, but instead whether or not you won a robotics competition or did a really compelling independent research project with a mentor in the field who writes a compelling letter of recommendation. Right? So here's a list of some notable test-free institutions. Obviously, being in California, I think about the University of California and Cal State systems that at this point, I believe, have all declared themselves as test-free this year. I can't recall what next year is going to look like for Cal States. I believe that UCs are test-free for 2 years. Eric, can you remind me where we're at with UCs and Cal States? Do you remember off the top of your head?
So Cal States are now test-free for 2022s as well.
Great. Okay, thank you. So yeah, here's a list of interesting schools across the spectrum of size and profile that have adopted a test-free stance either temporarily or more permanently. So the million-dollar question on many families' minds is, we see all of these institutions going test optional, but is it actually just a trap? Is it a way of signaling that if we don't submit a score, that our student is an abysmal test taker and their application is going to be sullied. And although I think that you should definitely treat test optional policies on their face as student-centric, as helpful, and not as traps, I also think it's important to look case by case at these universities, historically what applicants have done, what we imagine they're going to do now with regard to the submission of test scores, and also to look closely at the language on admissions websites, right? So how are they talking about test optional? Does it feel more like a temporary concession, or is it something that they're really excited about employing and expect many applicants to use? And I think a lot of the skepticism comes from, and this may have also been articulated in the last presentation that I gave, so this is probably going to be review for some of you. We look at the first year of going test optional at the University of Chicago, so one of the first highly selective colleges to adopt a test optional policy. And although there were some great things that came with it, so including the number of first-gen and low-income students who committed to attend, you'll notice that only 10 to 15% of their freshman class did not submit scores that year, and approximately 50% of submitters achieved a 1500 or better. I think this also secured the bragging rights for the University of Chicago that year for having the highest average SAT and ACT scores across the country. How funny that with the test optional policy that would happen. But when you look at the calculus, it makes sense. So when you don't necessarily have any more spaces available for students, but you soften the standards of eligibility or the criteria of eligibility by removing test scores from the equation, you're going to create an outsized applicant pool. You're going to also then plummet your admit rate and increase the average test scores, which then helps colleges like the University of Chicago climb the much bemoaned US News and World Report rankings, because test scores continue to factor fairly prominently in that little recipe that gives you your ranking. All right. So the question that Eric and I are often mulling over is, are we going to have a group of University of Chicago clones amongst the highly selectives? This exact same thing is going to play out. If we look at the language of admissions policies at these schools, we have some of the peers of University of Chicago, Northwestern, Rice, and Georgetown. They use some of the terminology that I did earlier in referencing the utility of these exams, that they provide a nice external benchmark of college readiness, that common yardstick. Northwestern cites the data that's been shown year over year that in combination with grades, test scores provide a incremental validity. They're more predictive of academic performance freshman year than if either of those factors were taken separately. And then we have Georgetown, which has always been a rogue agent. They love these exams. They have long encouraged students to take the SAT subject tests and to report every test score on their testing transcripts, even though students don't need to do that, right? So for this group, the takeaways are admit rates are as low as 5 to 6%. Nearly every applicant is highly qualified, and nearly every applicant is denied, okay? Historically, high test scores have been necessary, but insufficient. So we joke that they can help you enter a pool of eligibility for consideration, but there are no golden ticket test scores. Not even a perfect score is going to ensure you admission to the Yales, the Dartmouths, the whatever of the world. I don't have to tell this audience twice, you already know that. We do assume that this group is more likely to return to requiring tests, but if test optional does continue, we're looking at the writing on the wall, most applicants will still submit. And this is laid bare by both some of the early decision data that I'll be sharing with you, but also the class of 2021 trends. Those students that were more likely to get the highest scores on these exams were more likely to find test centers in spite of the pandemic. and submit those scores to highly selective universities. So again, takeaway for your students, you know this, but it does not mean it's easier to get into a school because it is test optional. In fact, in some cases, the inverse might be true with the surge of applicants. And with some of the data, the trends that are emerging for class of 2021, that appears to be the case. So Penn, in a headline, accepted 15% of early decision applicants to the class of 2025, a record low. So I believe it dipped from 19 or about 20% to 15%. And of those admitted, only 24% did not include test scores. So if you're applying to Penn, it's likely that the majority of your peers are going to be submitting test scores that are quite high. Turned on its head, I do think it's also compelling to say that about a quarter of applicants that were admitted did not have tests. That's quite exciting, I think, for a first-year policy in place, even if it is a little bit lower. Now let's shift the conversation to some selective state schools that maybe aren't as unreasonable as the highly selectives in terms of admit rates. So I have both, I should say, the University of Maryland, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Although they are certainly test positive in their language and encourage students to admit these scores if they are helpful, they'll often say students will not be disadvantaged if they fail to produce a test score. And you might be scratching your heads and wondering, well, how can both things be true? How can a shiny golden test score be both useful in my application and not detrimental, though, if I just leave it out completely? And the best analogy that I've come up with, and it's imperfect, but bear with me, the University of California, obviously very top of mind. UCLA is about a stone's throw from my apartment. And you have the opportunity to report employment history on the application. And whether or not you decide to put in employment history doesn't obviously have like an immediate net positive or negative. But once you do fill in that box, there is data that you're revealing about yourself that is subject to interpretation. It's a bell that you cannot unring, right? So I'll put myself on the chopping block. I probably would not be behooved to share the fact that in between my junior and senior year of high school, I worked about, I don't know, 5 hours a week, got terrible hours, at American Eagle Outfitters as the women's denim specialist, surprise, surprise. And, I basically did that just to make a little bit of money so I could party with my friends, right? And although I don't besmirch the great work that I did and learned a lot about rises and washes, that's probably a very different thing to share than a student who worked full or part-time to support their family or engaged in a job or internship that dovetails very nicely with a intended major or an aspirational career path. So test scores, I think, can provide a similar service that if they are in line with the chorus of the rest of application features, they further validate what you're sharing in your transcript and your personal statement. If they're reflective of your tenacity as a student, then by all means, please share. But if they are out of sync, if they are out of tune, then no need to do so when you're applying to some of these schools. So for this group, again, admit rate is competitive, but far more reasonable than the first group. Test scores matter, but not any more than any other of strength, especially with regard to the transcript, which usually is of the greatest importance, right? Optional or not, strong test scores can be additive, but I think that they will not necessarily torpedo your chances of getting in. Even if your score is slightly lower, maybe, than you would like, or if you are omitting a test score, your chances will not be torpedoed. But this lays the groundwork for our belief at Compass that most students should plan to test, right? And you want to, again, keep those spaces of possibility open. And the decision to submit is going to hinge on those institutional averages, those mid-50th percentile ranges, the relative strength of other application features, and lastly, some of the elements of scholarships and credit considerations that haven't gone away. So you might have a student that is applying to a state school, that still has an academic index that requires a student to achieve a particular GPA and test score to qualify for X number of dollars of financial aid per year. Or with a certain test score in place, they might be able to bypass a freshman composition or math class, right? And not having a test score prevents those outcomes from happening, right? So always read the fine print, and this is what your students are going to be doing with you as they narrow down their college lists. A couple of simplified things as we look at the pool of, again, EA and ED data. I have information here from Tufts and Boston. So you'll notice that within the ED cycle, 18% more students were admitted to Tufts with than without test scores. And there was a slightly higher admit rate amongst submitters of tests. You can see 50% of that pool with tests got in versus 41% without tests. And then for Boston University, it's turned over a little bit. So actually a larger number of students did not submit tests, all right? Within that ED pool, 43% did. Slightly higher admission rate amongst non-submitters, right? Without tests, 56%, with tests, 44%. Tests alone, obviously, were not the main rationale for decisions made for either of these colleges. Still, holistic review is in place, but I think that this does generally show that test optional is being taken seriously, although slightly asymmetrically at Tufts versus Boston. And then last, Eric actually just put together this really lovely set of slides looking at the growth in EA and ED application pools. So you can look here, class of 2020 versus class of 2021, this really outsized growth. I think there are plenty of students that are throwing their hats in the ring when applying to schools like Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Penn, and Brown, thinking, all right, maybe we do have a chance. Normally, I wouldn't have been compelled to apply because of my gnarly little test score. It was a blemish, but now I'm gonna try my hand anyway. And you can see the growth here, right? 57% growth in an applicant pool at Harvard. It's crazy. Yale, similarly, 37, and then we see in the the 20% for the remainder of those schools for the class of 2021. Simultaneously, when we look at the slivers of students that were admitted, all right, with EA or ED, it's mostly shrunk for the vast majority of the IVs that we have here. So let's see. Excuse me, actually, I guess it's slightly grown for those students for Yale, Dartmouth, and Brown. But Harvard and Penn, we see a steep decline. Eric, I feel like I'm missing something here. Can you clean up what I was trying to articulate?
That's basically it. It's that Harvard and Penn, you see that the admits are going down even as the number of applicants goes up. And then the other ones, Yale, Dartmouth, and Brown, yes, the number of admits increased, but at far below the pace of the number of applicants. So kind of the punchline to this is the next slide, which is you have the denominator, the number of admits getting bigger and bigger, and the numerator either shrinking or getting bigger at a smaller rate than the denominator. So what's, of course, going to happen? Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. So pool of applicants increases, admit rate declines at all of these IVs. And I think that although we're looking just at this very incredibly small subset, of schools, I have a feeling it's likely to continue for a broader group of national universities and liberal arts colleges with very tiny admit rates. Those are only going to dwindle with time, right? So now I'm going to pass the baton to dear Eric and stop sharing my screen so Eric can share his.
Thanks, Matt.
Let me stop. There we go.
Okay. Bear with me, everyone, as I bring up the slide deck and make sure it is, are you seeing my notes or are you seeing the actual presentation?
We're seeing notes.
Swap those. How about now?
Gorgeous.
Okay. So at this point, the kind of transition is understanding the landscape of what we're seeing with just this very preliminary data. And a cautionary note, we shouldn't read into these tea leaves too much just yet. What happens in an early action, early decision round may or may not be indicative of what happens with most students in the regular decision round. There was a question that got some discussion in the chat that I think I'll quickly address right now. And essentially that was, well, are students still getting an advantage by submitting test scores? And right now the answer is it depends. Most of the Ivy League has not given us any data on their testing, even though we've seen the admit rates go down. The one that has is the one Matt talked about, Penn. And to dig back into that stat a little bit, those who submitted test scores performed twice as well as in gaining admission as those who did not. Here's though that there's a temptation to jump at an irrational conclusion, which is, oh my gosh, having a score for a competitive school doubles my chances. That's not true, one, because it's the value of the score, not just having the score itself. And two, there's a hidden correlative effect. Those students who may have gotten the high test scores are the ones who may have stuck with test prep throughout 3, 4. I think mine's up to 5. I heard of a student who had 5 canceled SATs before they finally took an SAT, and this student ended up hitting a score of a 1580. So that kind of behavior often correlates with students who are pursuing and have been pursuing the high school experience that tries to get them admission to these competitive schools. Captain of band, a varsity athlete, starting an own club, something like that. So it's impossible to kind of desegregate this just having scores versus what those students have in the rest of their applications. With that in mind, then, I spoke in the beginning how our advice, actually turning all this landscape into what are we advising to class of 2022 students who are confronting all of this? And believe it or not, it's the best short pithy answer is prepare as if it's a normal year. And it's not a normal year. And there's a ton of caveats to this. One being, it's possible you will prepare and your exam will still get canceled. But the metaphor I'm kind of helping parents through to understand that is this is a bad metaphor since not many people are traveling now, but it's like boarding a flight. Test preparation is like getting on a plane and doing about 3 months of preparation to get 90% of the way to your destination. And then you're in a holding pattern over that test date to see if it's going to happen or not. If it happens, you can push the rest of the 10% of the way there. A few meetings with your tutor, another practice test, and hopefully you go one and done. If it doesn't happen, you're still 90% of the way there. Because the way that we've seen test prep work is not like studying for a history test where the knowledge grows rusty with time. And if you're like me, when I was taking, a European history class in high school, you study it all the night before, get it on the exam, and out the window the next day. They're much more behavior-based. It's more like learning an instrument. And once you have a certain level of proficiency, then you're at a stage where you can kind of hold on to that proficiency, at least through the course of the rest of your high school. Not to say that a little refresher prep doesn't help, and not to say that that's what we are recommending that to parents. But that's kind of how we're thinking through this. And the reason is if we start at the very end with these class of 2022 students and think, who's going to be in the better situation? Those who have test scores or those who don't? Well, with scores, you have 3 options. You can submit your scores to every school you apply to. You can submit to some, or you can submit to none. Without scores, you're relegated to option number 3, which is you just have to apply to test optional schools and hope for the best. A brief anecdote here, I was on a call with a parent the other day who was really on the fence about investing the money and pushing her student through test prep when it's more Zoom. The deal sealer for this parent was she worked at a bank and reads over resumes and says, yeah, when I see someone trying, when I see that effort there, I have a bias towards the person who's putting that in. And because there's still enough time and enough test dates, most parents are still thinking that there will be opportunities to take those tests. So she ended up pursuing to do testing. So with that in mind, then we're still seeing a lot of the same kind of, again, irrational decision making that we see in a normal year when students are hitting this time of the year, early January, and deciding how to use their junior years. One of the main decisions to make is whether to take the ACT or SAT. And this cartoon, of course, is a little bit of a far-fetched way of going about that. Believe it or not, though, when I read this, I thought, oh my gosh, I did do better on the ACT. I actually am left-handed. So I looked up when I was born, and I was born on a Thursday, not a Tuesday. Regardless, though, in even a normal year, I feel that a lot of the peer pressure mill and the parent pressure mill and the self-pressure just creates a lot of anxiety around these exams that makes them feel like they do more than they actually do. They don't. Matt, could I call on you what's your pithy little phrase about what these exams actually measure?
Oh, yeah. I'll often say that the SAT and ACT are crude assessments of a narrow band of academic skills tested under duress. And the duress piece is the most important feature here, because if you got rid of something like the clock, you'd probably see very different trends in performance amongst students. So that the crudeness and the heart palpitations that they induce is, I think, probably their most prominent feature.
Yeah, definitely. And you'll notice what's omitted there, of course, is intelligence, creativity, how well you work with others, important life skills. So one of the parts of my job that I'm doing a lot of right now is being the myth buster. And the main myths that I'm hearing from parents as they come at this is, one, should I test or should I not test? And I think a lot of the data that Matt shared, as well as kind of thinking, well, where are you better situated at the end of this? Having scores or not having scores can do a fair job busting that one. Some of the other ones that we'll hear, though, are that, well, the ACT is easier, or it's harder because it has a science section, or XYZ school prefers one exam or the other. And a lot of these are kind of in conversation what we're trying to steer people away from. These are, smart, savvy people, many of whom have had an older child even go through test prep. But at Compass, what our best practice is essentially making this decision, ACT or SAT, using data and using full-timed practice tests, or if students had the PSAT happen, using that PSAT in place of the SAT. As I'm sure this audience knows very well, no schools prefer one exam over the other anymore. The last school to throw out kind of the old way of thinking was Harvey Mudd in the early 2000s, where they did not accept the ACT, but now for the past 15 years or so they do. So then the conversation just moves on to comparing the two exams. And I'm sure you're familiar with the two tests, but I'll kind of weave in some of the newsier bits that we're hearing as we're comparing the two exams and leading parents and students through this decision process. One is with the PSAT. A lot of students did not get to take it. Some did, and I know where I am in Illinois, some of the public schools did get that PSAT in at the end of October, a little bit later than they would have in mid-October. Others are taking it January 26th, and the makeup day. Still others, though, are offering alternate entry. And this is a whole nother can of worms. Matt, I'm going to do my best to summarize what's going on with alternate entry, but please offer some color commentary here. So essentially what alternate entry is, this happens in a normal year, non-pandemic. Basically, if the student can't take the PSAT the day it's offered at their school, they can still enter the national merit competition by taking a later PSAT or by actually taking an SAT. So there are a few changes this year, though, with the wideswept cancellations of the PSAT. One is, for the first time this year, a student can opt out of taking their school-sponsored PSAT and then take an SAT in the spring. And even if the school is hosting it, even if it happens, that's not usual in a typical year, which for really savvy parents who are hard charging and who have a high scoring kid who want that national merit honor, it opens up possibly gaming the PSAT. That's because taking an SAT, there's a few more questions. The scoring scale is a little higher, which means you can have mulligans on the hardest questions. It might be a little bit easier to hit a national merit qualifying score with an SAT. An SAT also gives you more time to prepare, since they would happen later in the spring, and you might have multiple shots, taking 2 SATs or 3 even. At Compass, though, our advice is that this is not a good idea. One is it violates the spirit of national merit. And typically, alternate entry is really for legitimate excuses, not just to boost your chances of scoring national merit scores. The other is there's a lot of things, little details that still have to go right here in order to successfully qualify for national merit via alternate entry. One being that the school or the counselor has to support that student in order to get national merit. Has to actually say, yes, this is okay, even if they knew the student was trying to game their way to national merit. So we're not bringing this up to students, and I would encourage everyone who has access to this kind of information not to game the system too much for students who might be able to take advantage of this. Matt, can you color in any of the gaps here with alternate entry?
You killed it. I have nothing else to add there.
Okay. The purpose of the PSAT basically is to get that first reading on how you do with the SAT, and then compare it against an ACT practice test. So I'll rush through some of the construction of this exam. Of course, the SAT and the PSAT start with a long reading section. I often see that the first passage is the one where we see lots of misses from students, not because they don't know how to do it, but because they're seeing this at 8 a.m. on a weekend after they've rolled out of bed at 7 or so. My advice to students is, just as you wouldn't run a 5K without doing a little warm up, I ask them to do about 1 passage at home, just so we're eliminating those bumpy takeoffs with the reading section. As you can see, this is from Adam Smith, published in 1759. In other words, the stuff of teenage nightmares. We follow with a writing and language section. Here we see that students can do very well once they just refresh some of the rules that they haven't learned since 5th or 6th grade. And it's no wonder that some students are, a little shaky on grammar. If they're reading, say, this book, A Tale of Two Cities, in school, and I'll ask you just to skim over these 2 different ways of punctuating the famous first lines. Which one do you think Dickens used? Which one do you think the correct way is to use on the PSAT or SAT? Yeah, so Dickens made about a dozen comma splices. So if students are using this as the reason for why they're picking a certain answer, then you have to learn the hidden rules of a PSAT or SAT or ACT with comma splices and other grammar rules. Sometimes parents will say, well, my student's better at algebra, they should take the SAT, it's more algebra. Or my student's better at geometry, or kids will self-identify as better at geometry, therefore I should take the ACT. This is looking at a higher level at just the prevalence of algebra on the SAT versus the prevalence of geometry on the ACT, and making a conclusion that way is not an accurate way to actually determine where you're better suited. It comes down to the student actually to just sit down, take a full practice test in each, and determine what the better fitting test is. One observation I will make, though, is that the SAT is 50% math. ACT is only 25%. So when you do have really strong math students who are better at math than they are at ACT science just naturally, it does behoove them to double down on their strength sometimes and take the SAT. About the only indicator that I'll see where I can really say, oh my gosh, this kid is probably better at the ACT is when I see I'm going to bring up the ACT actually now. When I see a student coming in low on English and high on science. That's because we see that English, like writing and language, is often the easiest score to bring up with coaching, and science often the hardest. Science has a sticky score, and there's no reason why. This is a science passage. I mean, imagine you're a high schooler seeing this at the end of 2.5 hours of testing, what the instinctive thing to do is. So finally, a word about this optional essay. Optional should be like underlined 3 times here, and I would even cross it out and it should say maybe even not required anymore. That's because these are the 3 schools that still require the essay. Often when I'm talking to a parent and they ask about the essay, I ask, is your student planning on applying to West Point? And if the answer is no, that's often a good enough reason not to take the essay anymore. This is a big change in kind of the past year. As early as last year, I believe at this time, the UCs still were requiring the essay. And as the #1 consumer of standardized tests, the University of California system, that was keeping the essay alive. But even before that, we were told by the Dean of Admissions at the University of Southern California, they've never not allowed a student in because of a low essay score. So at the same time, there was a webinar given recently by Tufts, BU, and Northeastern that was widely praised for its transparency on test, their data on test optional and what they're seeing in the early action, early decision. And a lot of those college admissions readers praised the essays that students were giving them as part of their application, not the ACT or SAT, particularly in a lot of COVID stories, of course. And some of the most compelling were those where the reader read something new about COVID and how it personally impacted the student and their learning experience. So writing matters, of course. It's just that this timed exercise is really falling out of favor, and we're almost never even prepping students for it anymore. So the exercise that we recommend encompasses, again, using that PSAT or SAT, and then comparing that with a practice ACT, and using a concordance like this, which is the same one that colleges use. So if we see a student coming in at these scores on the ACT or SAT, just kind of follow the line up and the line across, and that student naturally favors the SAT. Typically, the student's qualitative experience does align with the quantitative experience. Sometimes it doesn't, but usually it does. If this hypothetical student probably would be saying something like, I felt the ACT was too fast, didn't like that science section, the SAT just had a better pace for me, and then the scores might agree. What we see more frequently, though, about, I would say, a little over half the time, is you'll see students come in and land squarely in this judgment call zone. So there's no quantitative reason where they're favoring the ACT or SAT. Sometimes, so typically what I'll do is I'll ask the student, okay, well, what felt better to you? And often what I get here is, I don't care, or I hated them both. So here's where the next step is to dig into where they have the more potential to improve. And what I use here are the score reports that they get from their practice tests. These are wonderful for my job, which is kind of counseling people to steering them into one test or the other. And the reason they're so good is because they give us such a rich repository of data on the student's performance. If you've ever seen an official ACT or SAT score report, they're pretty bare bones. They're helpful when you get the question answer service from the SAT, which is offered a few times a year. But the score reports kind of don't give you a whole lot and aren't as useful for helping you improve your score as something like this, for instance, where you can see how a student performs against similar scores. This is the ACT math section, 60 questions. The height of the bar indicates how difficult the question is. And so because every single point, easy, medium, or hard, is all worth 1 raw point towards your score, the goal is to make sure that a student is acing the easy and medium parts of the test. Here, if I saw this come in from a student, and I saw this chunk of misses in the middle, whereas this chunk of right answers at the end, to me, this would indicate a high potential for the student to improve their math section, simply because I know their math skill is high enough that they can get these hard questions right. This was just due to careless errors. Maybe it was due to some funny math that they haven't gone over for a couple years. Maybe they just zoned out a little bit, as indicated by this blue bar, which shows that they left a question blank. So if I was comparing this against an SAT score report where I noticed the student acing the easy and medium part, but only missing the hard questions, I might steer the student towards the ACT because it would be easier to improve. And that's kind of the spirit of all of test prep, is just be efficient with it. 3 to 4 months of preparation is good for most students. They'll reach their peak scores early on in their preparation program. As Matt noted early on, endless amounts of effort do not yield endless and higher results. So we're really trying to steer them towards the exam where they will put in the minimal amount of effort for the maximum amount of return. So what does it look like when we're planning out the rest of junior year up until the students is going to submit their application? Well, it's really stringing testing into their schedule and weaving it through in a smart way. Believe it or not, this slide hasn't changed from pre-pandemic. I was kind of expecting us to have to rip it up and totally make a new one for pandemic times, but the reason that didn't happen is because of the way that students progress with these exams and kind of the goals, the big benchmarks are still the same. Let's start at the end. In 12th grade fall, that's the last chance students have to take their test. Also a great time to test. Again, we're friendly with the admissions people at USC. So this is another bit of data they slipped us. But basically, most of their students who get admitted, tested, are using scores from fall of senior year. That may be surprising because a lot of parents and students want to be done with this early. But the data indicates that just by virtue of making your way through more school, maybe getting through more math, taking the test multiple times, students do get better at it and just maturing as high schoolers, which means that moving backwards a little bit, before the summer of senior year, our recommendation is that students have one, if not two, official ACTs or SATs under the belt. The reason is that then they're able to kind of look at their college lists, look at their scores. And this year in particular, we should have better data and more data about how students are performing in with and without test scores at schools. And they'll be able to say, I'm good, I don't need testing anymore, or I should retest. And I want to prep over the summer, or I want to take a fall of senior year exam. Which means that most students should be starting preparation now for a spring of junior year test date. And when that test date is totally individualized to the student, yes, based on their scores, but also based on their schedules and everything else that they have going on with extracurriculars and academics. Taking multiple tests also enables students to have flexibility in how they use these exams. None of these really existed when I was in college. In high school in the early 2000s. Students have so much more flexibility now in terms of super scoring, using score choice and self-reporting. Just clarifying I'm sure we're all familiar here with what these terms mean, but there's a little bit of data here that's somewhat interesting. Most schools these days are super scoring the SAT and or ACT. A few more do super score the SAT than the ACT, Dartmouth being an example that does super score SAT, not ACT. That's not something I ever bake into decision making though, with when students are choosing which test is the better fit. Score choice, basically students can submit their highest scores. This really eases their anxiety early on. The concern of a lot of students is, what if I bomb a test? Which I'm sure everyone's experienced at some point, and it's not a fun experience. The good news, though, is with score choice, you don't have to show schools that bomb test. Just don't. Schools won't count it against you, most of them, but we all understand the psychological reasons for not wanting schools to see a test that you did poorly on. And the truth of the test prep, too, is most students are not going to bomb a test if they've done their steady preparation, because the tests are standardized and you can replicate your scores because the tests are designed that way. So most schools, again, are allowing for score choice. And finally, self-reporting. This is mostly this is when students can tell colleges what they got without sending an official score report. And the motives here are mostly rooted in equity. And essentially, it costs $12 to submit an ACT score report. I'm sorry, $13 to submit an ACT. And of course, because ACT and SAT are always competing with one another, the SAT beats the ACT by $1 whole. It costs $12 to submit an SAT score report. But just think of how this would multiply up if a student is applying to even six or seven schools and needs to submit 3 test dates from each. It could easily get into the hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And for some students who don't have fee waivers, that could be a prohibitive expense. So these are all what I would consider wonderful trends. Matt, do you have any kind of color you want to add to the three S terms, I guess, in these trends?
No, I don't think so. I think that just with regard to the timeline slide, it's why we're arguing that most students should plan to, at minimum, take 2 official tests, allowing, again, their practice tests to dictate whether or not they're poised to get a score they're happy with. And that more and more colleges are embracing self-reporting over time, which I think is really terrific.